The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight on the agenda, John Michael McGrath and I with our weekly onpoli podcast.
If the Liberals were in fact able to take this seat from the Progressive Conservatives, that would be a sign that they are at least competitive in a part of the province where they really haven't been for quite some time.
A bunch of things here. Hello again.
Hello, sir.
A bunch of things here before we get started. Number one, it occurred to me that I think since we started videoing this podcast, I have only worn shirts that have referred to places west of Toronto. So I thought today I'd show some love to the eastern part of the province. So I am an hour 45 east of Toronto with this one, Lakefield, Ontario. Okay. Beautiful spot. And there we go. Props to east of Toronto, not just west.
And we will be talking about east of Toronto later in the podcast as well.
We sure will. Now, I see you're not only east or west of Ontario, you're way up in the sky with that one.
Out of our jurisdiction entirely. I was feeling, what can I say, old and cranky this morning. And so this is the, when I was a kid, we had 9 planets. And I want to say at the breakfast table this morning, my kids started an argument with me about whether Pluto was actually a planet or not.
What's the verdict?
Well, I strongly maintain that Pluto is still a planet, and kids these days are being taught that it isn't.
I thought Pluto was a dog in a cartoon, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
That too.
Yeah. As much as we love talking Ontario politics, I think we have to acknowledge that the biggest political story in the world this past week was the presidential debate in the United States. So let's just, before we get to Queen's Park, do a minute on that. Did you watch?
I did. Did you?
I sure did. Did you watch every minute of it?
Yes, I stayed up late to watch that.
As did I. And, okay, what'd you think?
I thought it was an excellent debate in terms of the showcasing the candidates, if I could put it that way. I did not actually watch the prior debate with Joe Biden and Donald Trump.
That was the most consequential presidential debate ever.
I woke up the next morning and all I saw was the wailing and gnashing of teeth from Democrats. And I was like, oh, okay, I missed something important. So that was one reason why I made sure to catch this one.
There was one fascinating part about this Trump-Harris debate, and that was they did a lot of split screen. And when he was talking, the facial gestures she made while she was talking to convey disgust, astonishment, amazement, they were really quite something.
Yes.
They were really quite something. And I think, when you're a candidate up there, you not only get to try to influence the electorate when you are speaking, but when you are listening. And I thought she did a good job trying to convince people of the craziness of her opponent in some of the facial expressions she made when she was just listening.
Yes. And so one thing I wanted to bring up, you have moderated debates, obviously not U.S. debates, but you've moderated both provincial and federal debates before. And I got to ask, you've never had to handle somebody like Donald Trump. And there has been some criticism, primarily from conservatives in the States, about the moderators of this debate who, allegations of unfairness. I'm going to put my cards on the table and say that I thought they did an excellent job. But do you ever think about how would you handle somebody like Donald Trump?
I do think about that from time to time, and I guess the first conclusion I come to is I'm glad I've never had to do one of those, because I can say I think I've done 3 federal and 4 provincial debates, and the candidates, the leaders on the debate stage in the debates that I've done have all, how do I say this, behaved. They've followed the rules.
Yeah.
The moderator's job is to enforce the rules. And so I'm going to take a bit of issue with you on the moderators of this debate at ABC. They did not enforce the rules as it related to who gets to speak when. To me, that was the biggest complaint I had about them, was that they did let Donald Trump say, I want another word, and they let him. And when you looked at the math after the debate was over, I think, what did he have, 7 or 8 more minutes of speaking time than her?
Yeah.
Now, you could argue that might not be good for his cause, but if part of the job of the moderator is to make sure that they get equal time, which is part of the job, they did not do well on that.
No, and the criticism that has come from the conservative side of the spectrum is that the fact-checking that the moderators did of some of the more extreme claims that former President Trump made. There were really only, I think, 3 substantive moments where they really pushed back on correcting the factual record.
And eating the dogs and cats was one of them. Yeah.
I understand why, in general, moderators would not want to do that. It's not the job of the moderator to be debating the people
I agree.
on the stage.
I've never thought it was the moderator's job to fact check.
And yet, there are really were some extreme cases, some extreme claims, and I think it was important to not let some of the most outrageous falsehoods stand.
There is a problem, and look, I'm just saying this as an objective case. I'm not indicating a favorite one way or the other. The empirically provable fact of the matter is Donald Trump engages in more falsehoods, and the nature of his falsehoods are more breathtaking than any candidate for president ever. Yeah. And as a result, if the moderators have decided that fact-checking is part of their job, and apparently these ones had, then you can't be surprised that there was more fact-checking done on Trump than on Harris. Now, you could go after her for failing to answer questions. The very first question was, are Americans better off today than they were 5 years ago, or 4 years ago? Yeah. And she didn't even answer that. No. So, I mean, they should have been pressing her more on answering the question. They could have, I guess, if they wanted to fact check, could have fact checked him a lot more, because there were a lot of bizarre falsehoods coming out of his mouth as well.
Yes.
And with that, we could go on this, but I suspect we should talk Queen's Park. On to issue one. This past Monday, the province announced nearly $19 million in funding for infrastructure to help support the construction of nearly 4,000 new homes in Prince Edward County. The money comes from the Housing Enabled Water Systems Fund that has been doling out money to cities across the province to upgrade their water systems.
Yeah, traditionally, you do need water to have a home, water, sewer, these kinds of things.
I believe that is true. Coincidentally, and I'm sure this is just a coincidence, the money was given ahead of a by-election, which will take place in the riding of Bay of Quinte, which is what it's called, Thursday, September 19th, to replace former Cabinet Minister Todd Smith. There are a number of candidates seeking your approval if you live in the Bay of Quinte area in the next election, and JMM is going to take you through them right now.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have Tyler Alsop for the Progressive Conservatives, who is a Belleville City Councillor. Sean Kelly is the Liberal candidate. He is also a Belleville City Councillor and is also a broadcaster. Amanda Robertson for the NDP is vice chair of the Hastings and Prince Edward District School Board. And the Greens are represented by Laurie Borthwick, who is a healthcare worker.
Here is the latest on the stay of play in the riding of Bay of Quinte. Liaison was in the field, I guess, Sunday and Monday earlier this week. They surveyed 541 voters. There's a margin of error in this poll of plus or minus 4.21%, 19 times out of 20. I think by law we have to say all that stuff. This race is tight. Kelly of the Liberals is in first with 36%. Alsop of the Conservatives next at 35%. Then comes Robertson of the NDP at 18%. Borthwick of the Greens at 5%. That is about as close as it gets.
Absolutely. So, I mean, let's start by warning our listeners, I guess, that, polling by elections in Canada, notoriously tricky. I think lots of pollsters have been embarrassed by results after the fact. I will not be surprised if the eventual numbers are different from what we just reported there. Just to give people an example, folks may remember the Milton by-election earlier this year. There was some polling suggested that would be a very close race. It ended up not being terribly close. That said, let's take these numbers for what they are right now. If the Liberals were to manage to carry this riding, it would be, I think in some ways it would be more important than if they had carried Milton. This was a riding that Todd Smith held from 2011 on. Mm-hmm. Sometimes, in the last two election cycles, he won it by really large margins, like 15, 20% margins. And so if the Liberals were, in fact, able to take this seat from the Progressive Conservatives, that would be a sign that they are at least competitive in a part of the province where they really haven't been for quite some time.
Yeah. The nice thing about by-elections is that the people who live in those areas, they feel the love from all the parties intensely for a very short period of time. Because, of course, this is not a general election where people are campaigning everywhere. You can afford to put everything in the kitchen sink into this. The leaders have all been to Bay of Quinte. There are door knockers for all parties that have been to Bay of Quinte. I'm hearing from Liberal sources that there's still a great deal of antipathy to the Prime Minister, even though he's federal. This is provincial. Yeah. A lot of antipathy to Justin Trudeau still, which may depress the Liberal vote. You never know. Yep. On the other hand, there's still there's a lot of concern about the current government of Ontario. So we'll see. We'll see.
Absolutely. And just one other point about the election. Even if the Liberals do not, in fact, carry it, the other thing to watch will be if they do a strong second, right, that would still be at least one positive indicator, because in the last two elections in Bay of Quinte, they were a distant third. Yeah. It was the NDP were the second place party. So there are a few ways that this could be somewhat good news for the Liberal Party.
Now, speaking of elections, we've had some developments about two current MPPs in the Ontario legislature that we want to pass along. whenever the next Ontario election is, and you know if you've been keeping up that we don't know when that is yet, Rick Byers, who is the Tory MPP for Bruce Grey Owen Sound, and Monique Taylor, who is the New Democrat MPP for Hamilton Mountain, they have both announced that they are not going to contest the next Ontario election whenever it is. Taylor, for her part, has also announced that she's going to try to run federally for the NDP in the next federal election. Now, in terms of the history, Hamilton Mountain has been an NDP riding provincially since 2011, so that will be a challenge for any other party to take. Bruce Grey Owen Sound, boy, you want to talk about a strong Tory seat? It's been Tory since the new boundaries were formed in 1999. The predecessor ridings that make up the current boundaries were Tory since 1990. So that's a pretty safe bet.
The escarpment lifted out of the ocean.
Something big would have to happen for the Conservatives to lose that seat.
Yeah, and I also note that Rick Byers was only elected for the first time in the last election, so it is notable to me that he's choosing not to run again. But you can see pieces in motion, right? They're setting the chessboard, right? We know that progressive Conservatives have been told basically to make their decision soon about whether they are running again or not. I suspect similar messaging is going out to the New Democrats. I know the Liberals are obviously, as you know, one of the smallest parties. They have lots of candidates to recruit. I know they are really busy doing that. So it's very interesting watching all of the machinery of election planning start spinning up.
And with that, we're off to issue 2. On the national stage, the New Democratic Party has ended the supply and confidence deal with the Liberals, ending the agreement that has helped keep Justin Trudeau the Prime Minister and given the NDP some legislative wins they otherwise might not have had. This obviously brings the prospects of a federal election into the nearer future. Premier Doug Ford, however, he has other ideas.
Yes, at a news conference on Monday, Doug Ford said he believed that Jagmeet Singh wouldn't trigger an election until after a very specific date. Let's take a listen.
As far as I'm concerned, MP Singh he's just blowing smoke. There's nothing more important to these greedy politicians than collecting a pension. And he was elected in October 2019, and October 19th, 2019. And I'll be floored, and I'll stand up here and apologize to all the greedy politicians if he calls the election early.
Yeah, the Premier got the date wrong, actually, when he said the pensions kick in as of such and such a date. He corrected himself at another news conference on Wednesday of this week, because I think the record shows Singh was first elected as the MP in Burnaby South in British Columbia in February 2019. Prior to the fall 2019 election. It was a by-election. Mr. Singh's pension eligibility, therefore, would actually kick in sooner than it would for other MPs who were elected that year. The question then becomes, how big a factor is pension eligibility when opposition politicians start to think about when they want to pull the plug on the federal Liberals? What do you think?
I don't think that Singh personally is terribly worried about being re-elected in Burnaby South, right? That would be the issue for him personally. But he does have a caucus to answer to, right? So maybe it will be a factor in his decision. But, you know, trying to force an election is such a big move. There's never just one factor to consider, and I would expect that in this case, it would be a relatively small one. We should also note that the NDP actually doesn't have the numbers to force an election if they choose to vote no confidence in the government. They have to get the Bloc Québécois to agree with them, which puts Prime Minister Trudeau in a bit of a nicer spot, a bit more comfortable spot, because he has more negotiating partners. But it necessarily makes the timing of an election more complicated.
Yeah, if the Bloc supports the Prime Minister, they're good to go.
Yep,
they're still good to go. Now, as you might imagine, Jagmeet Singh, when he heard what Doug Ford had to say about him, decided that he wanted to make a few comments too, so why don't we play what he had to say next? Sheldon, if you would.
I think Doug Ford needs to worry about delivering health care for people in Canada instead of being obsessed with alcohol. People in Ontario can't get the health care they need. They're struggling with the cost of living, and he's obsessed with alcohol and convenience stores. Like, I don't know any person that I've spoken to when I tour Ontario, when I'm in the communities, that say that that's their number one pressing issue.
Shots fired, I believe the kids say. I think it's also fair to remind our listeners that while city councillors, mayors, and MPs, federal MPs, all have pensions, provincial MPPs do not.
Correct.
In Ontario. Doug Ford will not get a pension from his time as Premier, nor will any current MPP. We've talked before about how that shapes the choices of provincial politicians, but we have a clear case at hand, right? Todd Smith has said that one of the reasons for his retirement and seeking private sector employment and thereby causing this by-election in Bay of Quinte is because he's at the point in his life where he needs to think about retirement security, and MPPs don't have pensions.
It is amazing how many people think Ontario legislators have gold-plated pensions like the federal members do. We should remind everybody that it was Premier Mike Harris in the 1990s who got rid of the pension. It's been almost 30 years since MPPs did not have pensions at Queen's Park. So for all of those of you who think these greedy buggers, they're only after their pensions, they don't have pensions and they haven't for almost 30 years. Now, I know we're all skeptical about politics. That is just the nature of the beast. And none of us can imagine that MPs would risk not being eligible for their pensions, and therefore they will allow the Trudeau government to remain in place because, of course, they want it to stay there long enough for them to be eligible for their pensions. However, this is where I need to remind everybody that that was exactly the kind of thinking that took place back in 1979, and I remember this well. The Conservatives were in power. They had a minority government in the federal parliament. They were convinced that the opposition Liberals would never jeopardize their pensions by defeating Joe Clark's government, because many people at that stage were not yet eligible for pensions. But the Liberals did. They did pull the plug on Joe Clark. They did force an election. They ran the risk of not getting pensions if Clark came back with a majority, for example. The current Prime Minister's father came out of retirement. He'd already stepped down. He came out of retirement to lead the Liberals to a majority government in 1980 in the next election. So it did work out well for those Liberal opposition members. I guess the lesson here is don't be so sure about what you think you know about people's motives, because you never know. And with that, we're on to issue 3. According to a new report, more than 1 million people used a food bank last year in the province of Ontario. The high cost of living is the most significant factor why people visit, and we know this because of an organization that tracks this information. Tell us more.
Right. So this is from Feed Ontario, which is a network of provincial food banks. They issued their annual report, and those 1 million people represent the largest single increase in food bank usage since the 2008 recession. Just really want to put a point on that. This is higher rates of food bank usage than we saw in the 2008 recession, and more than we saw during COVID. The report asked food bank clients various questions, and they found that 71% of respondents said they are worse off now than they were pre-pandemic. More than 2/3 of visitors had only $100 left each month after housing costs, and 22% said their housing costs exceeded their monthly income. We can use food bank usage, I think, as a bellwether for extreme economic precarity, right? These are places that people go to as a last resort when they are worried about losing housing if they can't pay their rent. They don't have enough money for both rent and groceries, so they go to the food banks.
In terms of recommendations, what does the Feed Ontario report have to say?
Well, unsurprisingly, they say, one solution to this is to increase the income supports that we have for people in this province. That includes the Ontario Disability Support Program and Ontario Works, more affordable housing, and particularly more affordable rental housing. The very large majority of food bank clients are renters. They are not the majority of people province-wide, so that gives you a sense of how particularly vulnerable renters are in this province. They make a recommendation for not necessarily like more employment, because unemployment is not historically high right now, but they do say that people are working full-time jobs and still not able to afford what they need to. So it's not just more jobs, it's better jobs, better paying jobs, so that people don't have to make that choice between rent and the groceries.
This is obviously a huge issue, so we should mention as well that our pal Nam Kiwanuka hosts a show called The Thread. They have a great episode on food insecurity in Ontario, and if you are listening on podcast right now, we will put a link to the description of that show in the show notes, and you can find it there. It is on YouTube. And with that, it's off to your column, my column. Okay, time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for TVO.org over the past week. Start us off. What do you got?
Well, talking about that food bank report that we were just discussing, I mean, one of the points that I wanted to make about this is really the centrality of the housing crisis in Ontario, right? It is eating up everything. And the housing crisis is different from other economic problems, right? When there's a recession, when there's a period of high inflation, in general, we know how to manage them, and things tend to return back to the normal economic progress that we are used to. The housing crisis is different because when you pump more money into the system, when people make more money, when people get raises, when people form new households, all the things that we want them to do, it just makes the housing crisis worse unless we figure out how to address this issue. There were some other headlines this week that frankly made me despair about the current state of housing policy in Ontario. I am not currently very optimistic about how we're going to move forward on that, but it's something that I think everybody needs to take seriously, because in the current state of affairs, it's almost as if good economic news isn't even possible, right? People get raises, and that money gets siphoned away by the banks that own mortgages and the landlords who own rental units, and people are in a very sort of structural way, people can't get ahead. And governments like economic good news. They like to run on economic good news, and it's just harder and harder to get that actual good news. Even as I say this in the column, there have been plenty of times in Ontario's recent history where the economy was much worse, and I don't want to dismiss the real hardships that people are going through now, but you and I have both seen much more severe recessions.
For sure.
Given how relatively well the economy is doing right now, it should not be the case that 1 million people are using food banks.
No question. Now, this may be a good opportunity for us to explain to the good people watching and listening that when you and I have an idea for a column, we don't just sit down and type it into the TVO website and it bingo shows up. We actually have to pitch the idea to an editor who either approves it or doesn't. Then when we write the column, the said editor, and maybe a second editor as well, vets the column and just make sure no spelling mistakes, no grammar mistakes, no factual mistakes, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So I have a column that is in the process of being vetted. It is not up on the website yet. I hope, as we tape this right now, it's not up yet, but essentially the piece is about a follow-up on a column I wrote before about how much cooperation the opposition either is or is not prepared to do to try to defeat the Ford government. The example I used in the last column was in France, where the opposition parties cooperated to stop the far right from winning. This column is about what's happened in British Columbia over the last couple of weeks, which has been fascinating.
Yes.
The party that used to be the Liberals is not running candidates in this election, not even the leader. They have stood down, and they have in fact told some of their candidates, you go run for the Conservatives, because we don't want to split the anti-NDP vote between too many parties. So we now have our first example in Canada of opposition parties cooperating in order to try to defeat a government that they obviously would like to kick out. And I merely say, Ontario opposition parties, New Democrats, Liberals, Greens, are you paying attention? This has happened in France. It's now happening in British Columbia. It might be something you want to consider here. Not recommending it, just putting it out there for your edification. That's all.
It is a fascinating case in BC because, I think functionally, the party formerly known as the BC Liberals is going to cease to exist. And that's, I think, the crucial difference. In Ontario, I don't think any of either the New Democrats or the Ontario Liberals is ready to strike their tents and walk away.
We cannot imagine that. No. They're both, frankly, they both get about 25% of the vote right now, so that's a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, the BC Liberals were... Mind you, the BC Liberals were the government of British Columbia 7 years ago. Yeah. So it just shows you how fast.
We're not talking about the mists of prehistory here.
Things can change quickly in this country. Okay, and with that, let's go to the mailbag. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, please send it to us at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, start us off if you would.
Right, so we have a question from an anonymous listener or viewer. It goes, hi there. I am an employee of the town of Cobourg, and recently the mayor of Cobourg, Lucas Cleveland, has suggested the town should consider leaving Northumberland County and floated that Cobourg, Port Hope, and Hamilton Township merge into a city of around 50,000. How would such a departure and merger work, and what impacts would it have not only on the local governments, but Northumberland County and the province? Kind regards, Anonymous. And if they're an employee of the town, you can understand why we are keeping them anonymous.
Exactly. And we love these kinds of questions, which are deeply nerdy and into the weeds. And I have a feeling that the answer to this question has something to do with the expression, municipalities are creatures of the province. So why don't you start us with some background on that?
Well, the short answer is you're exactly correct. But the longer answer, we're going to get into some context here. So for folks who don't know, Northumberland County is east of the GTA, and the entire county has a population of about 90,000 people, with Cobourg having about 20,000 people. It's one of 7 smaller municipalities that make up the county. Generally, we're talking about smaller towns with very large rural areas surrounding them. And there has been some tension between the county and the town of Cobourg recently over the issue of homelessness in particular. This is not an issue that is at all exclusive to Cobourg. The county has bought a building that they want to open a homeless shelter in Cobourg, while the town has imposed some licensing rules, and they want to set a bunch of conditions in place before the shelter opens. That's one possible reason for the tension that we're seeing, and one reason why we might see this proposal floated by the mayor. That said, the question of whether Cobourg, Port Hope, and Hamilton Township could be sliced off from Northumberland County, it's not that different in practice from the question of whether Mississauga can be sliced off from Peel Region. It is absolutely within the legislature's powers to redraw the boundaries of a municipality if MPPs choose to do that. But as we saw with the Mississauga case, it is also a much more complicated question than simply redrawing lines on a map. The current government decided that it was not worth the political headache to try and untangle that municipal situation. It is not just a matter of redrawing the lines on the map. You have to reassign responsibilities for all of the work that, in this case, the county does currently for the people of Cobourg and Port Hope and Hamilton Township, that they would expect a lot of those services to continue, and you have to figure that out.
I think the point you made about the political risk that the current government of Ontario is prepared to undertake in order to affect this, if in fact this is the way to go, that's huge right now. Because if in fact they are going to call an early election, an election a year early, as in next spring, you would not want one of what has traditionally been a pretty safe conservative seat. You would not want the good burghers of that constituency to be furious with you because you've done something that will irritate a large number for whom this might be, the single most important issue on which they'd want to vote. So you can imagine how the government stood down on Mississauga and why they weren't prepared to accept the headache here. You can imagine they do the same thing here.
Well, and just to add, I was looking at the numbers before we started shooting, and if I have my math right, we're talking about slicing off half of the population of Northumberland County and creating this separate municipality. And whatever that might mean for the people of Cobourg and Port Hope and Hamilton Township, it would leave Northumberland County with half of its population, and I'm going to guess less than half of its property tax base, and all of the residents of the new, smaller county would quite understandably be furious and would have all sorts of headaches to figure out and bills to pay.
Changing regional boundaries is never controversial. They did it in Thunder Bay 50 years ago between Fort William and Port Arthur, and they're still discussing it 50 years later about whether or not Queen's Park done them wrong by changing the boundaries there and creating one super city. Anyways, to be continued, as they say. Why don't you give the email just in case other nerds want to get in on this?
Again, if you'd like to ask about the content on the show, please aim us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And just before we go, a shout out to the folks in Mississauga. On Sunday, we will be at the Hazel McCallion Central Library for a conversation asking the question, will Gen Z, or Gen Z, I guess if we're in Canada, reboot democracy? That's for a program we do before live audiences called TVO Today Live. And you can join that audience if you like. Also, you can attend the world premiere screening of a new TVO series. It's called Unrigged, hosted by democracy advocate Dave Meslin. And that's all starting at 3 p.m. on Sunday. For more information, or for that matter to see past episodes, go to tvo.org/TVO Today Live. That's tvo.org/TVO Today Live. And that is the onpoli podcast for this Friday, September 13th, 2024. Until next Friday, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
My goodness, the last couple of months, an assassination attempt, the head of the Secret Service steps down, the president stands down from running for a second term, a new candidate seamlessly takes over. Is this the most unprecedented election in American history?
Every election, Steve, feels like the most unprecedented election in American history. I was watching a documentary about 1968 over the weekend, and that seemed pretty unprecedented at the time. And even looking back, it was pretty extraordinary. So obviously, we have a set of circumstances here that are quite extraordinary. We have an incumbent president who stepped down from running for re-election, a former president turned GOP nominee that was shot, albeit, just kind of grazed on the ear, thankfully. Survived that, but still quite extraordinary. And a vice president who stepped up and in no time at all has really garnered enormous support and enthusiasm from her party. All that is to say that it is definitely one that we are going to remember. And certainly we are 56 days from Election Day, but who's counting? We're really going to see how it goes. There's something that we talk about here in Washington, the October surprise. We're all holding our breath for everything that's happened this year. If there's still an October surprise to come, God help us all. But it's definitely been a pretty extraordinary year.
Andrew, we've already had the July surprise, the August surprise. I'm sure there's going to be a September surprise. Can you recall an election in your lifetime with these kinds of circumstances?
None, and I don't think any in American history, partly because of the singular figure of Trump. You've never had a president who's not only a career criminal, but a convicted criminal candidate, I should say, who's been a convicted criminal, a serial fraud artist, a serial abuser of women, essentially a malignant narcissist who's attempted to bring down the system of government, who's attempted to undermine the system of law.
Get off the fence and tell me what you really think.
All those qualities of him in particular. And then, of course, the stakes in this election, I think, are certainly since Lincoln, perhaps, I think are the largest. That I think it is very clear that if Trump is reelected, the democratic system of government and the rule of law in America will be under serious threat.
You agree with that, Kim?
Absolutely. This is an unprecedented election because of the stakes involved. And the stakes aren't only, as Andrew has said, in the domestic politics of the United States, but also in foreign policy too. If Trump is elected in November, the impact on the global system is going to be just immense. And so from that point of view, it's absolutely unprecedented.
Vivian, based on what you have seen since the new players were put in place, meaning Harris and Walz, and based on your understanding of what you expect to see over the next 56 days, do you think this election is going to be decided on policy differences among the candidates or more on all-out character attacks, which are also happening in abundance?
There definitely are people out there who do want to hear about policy, and at the end of the day, those are the issues that are going to really impact, anyone's view on either candidate. It's really the burden is on Harris at this point to really establish herself, to help the American people understand what she stands for. Is she a continuation of Biden? Does she break with him on certain policies? And if so, what? Also, something that we are going to be hearing a lot about on Tuesday night at the debate is how she switched her position on certain key issues in this election, particularly fracking, which is huge in places like Pennsylvania, a critical swing state, and on Medicare for All, where she has flip-flopped on that as well. We saw a CNN interview a couple of weeks ago where she said that her values haven't changed, but she really hadn't explained fully how that evolution took place. And so a lot of people really anxious to hear about that. But ultimately, a lot of this is about personality. There are very few Americans who don't have a pre-established view of Donald Trump at this point. They either love him or hate him. They might vote for him, but not really care for his rhetoric. Everybody has an opinion about Donald Trump here in the United States and probably around the world. So, for him, it's really about just not saying anything to blow it with key demographics that he needs, most specifically women, suburban white women especially. And that's where the Democrats start pushing the issue of abortion and reproductive rights in general, a very contentious issue where they want to highlight him as someone who's going to essentially rob them of those rights. And so that's when the issues come in. And Harris, especially on Tuesday night, is going to be looking to poke the bear a little bit on some of those issues so that she can provoke some sort of erratic response from him where you could kind of highlight these policy differences.
All right, let's pursue that. Andrew, let's get away from the mudslinging for a second and just look at the policy differences. Which are those that you believe are the most germane that could result in the win or loss either way?
Well, we have to understand, first of all, how few voters will actually decide this election, right? It just comes down to 7 swing states. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, Arizona, North Carolina, and Georgia. And it'll be a small number of voters within those states. What is striking about this campaign is how few people are actually changing their minds. And look at the conventions. Typically, conventions in the past, if you got a really good convention, you could get a bump of 5, 6, 7 points in the polls. In recent elections, it's been more like 1 or 2%. This election doesn't seem like there was any bump at all. So there's so many people who are so decided. So the small number of people who can actually be persuaded to change their minds on this, who are undecided between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, are a very strange beast. Maybe some of them can be turned on the issues, things like abortion, things like immigration, things like inflation, things like foreign policy. Maybe. I think a lot of it's going to come down to more things like, oh, I'm tired of this. This is boring. Let's see what else is on. You can see them attempting in their rhetoric, the Democrats in particular, trying to figure out what's the psychographic profile of somebody who could actually be undecided between these two candidates. So we can have all these discussions about the issues, and they matter to some voters somewhere. I don't think they're going to be decisive, frankly.
Let's put up this background here, shall we? This is Do Youth Sports Break the Bank? We're calling this. A recent report by Solutions Research Group consultants shared that 58% of parents interviewed, 58%, describe facing financial issues trying to keep their children enrolled in sports. The Jumpstart State of Play Youth Report has similar findings. 47% of children surveyed that do not play sports often say their reasoning for lack of participation is because sports are just too expensive. Okay, Marco, start us off. What do you want to tell us more about these findings?
Well, a couple of things. So great that we know that 1 in 2 or approximately 1 in 2 can no longer afford the cost of sport for their kids. It's the rate at which that has increased since pre-pandemic levels that is really startling. Based on our data, we knew that about 1 in every 3 families leading into 2020 couldn't afford the cost of sport. So to see that escalation in the lack of affordability is really what should be concerning. The other thing that we need to keep in mind, though, is that this is true. This cost as a barrier to participation is true regardless of where you are in the world. You can survey kids in the US, you can survey families in Europe, you can survey families in Australia. No matter where you survey, the number one barrier to participation is always going to be cost. Yet, many jurisdictions have found a way to overcome that. We don't have a systemic solution here in Canada, and given the urgency with which now families are saying they can't afford the cost of sport and play when their kids need it most, we should start to be thinking about solutions that are systemic.
And we shall get to some ideas as we continue our conversation. Are these, you're surrounded by people who are athletic and young people, all the time, right? At YMCAs everywhere. So are these numbers representative of what you see in your experience?
Yeah, I think to support what Marco just said, we see it every day where at the YMCA we have about 90,000 roughly individuals and families across the GTA from Oshawa to Mississauga. And 1 in 5 utilize the YMCA's financial assistance program. And the majority of those happen to be the kids and the youth. And definitely the findings from the Canadian Tire Jumpstart report are seen every day in our centers. And one of the things that we've noticed is that since the pandemic, there has been, I wouldn't say a less of a desire, but that was a major disruption to kids' rhythm of participation. And it's a definite challenge that we're facing to try to recruit kids back and recruit youth back into our programs. And that's our focus at the YMCA, which is to try to continue to support them through our own financial assistance program, but also partnering with organizations like Canadian Tire Jumpstart. They've been a great support to us as well.
Well, here's where I get a little needlessly provocative with the former All-Star over here on my left. I can imagine there are people watching this or listening to this who will think to themselves, Bruce Kidd was one of the great runners of this country's history. What's the barrier to participation if you just want to get out and run around in the streets? What's the barrier to participation if you just grab a soccer ball and go to the park, or grab a football and go to the park? How can we have a financial barrier to participation in sports, which you would think would be fairly easy to do?
Well, one explanation or contributing factor is the immiseration of public institutions like physical education and school sports in our public schools. I mean, I went to the Olympics on the basis of public programs. My friend and colleague Bill Crothers, after whom a school is named in York region, went to the Olympics on the basis of public programs. But public programs can no longer do that. The demands for sport development are much greater, and schools and municipalities haven't been able to keep up. If you read the surveys of People for Education, you'll see that over the period that my colleagues have talked about, user fees for participation in sport have gone up and up and up, and really only parents in the rich neighborhoods can now afford the cost of a team.
But that presupposes that the school is the sort of focal point of all athletic activity, and anybody...
But it's the entry,
okay,
and it should be the basis. And I would say all of our public commitments as a country talk about the school and the municipality as the basic entry for sport. The other measure that I want to introduce, Steve, is the class background of our top athletes, whether it's in pro sports like the NHL or whether it's in the Olympic team. The class background is much higher than it was in my era. When I grew up, the best hockey players were from small rural
Timmins,
towns.
Brooklyn Lake, yes, for sure.
Well, my colleague Rick Runo at Simon Fraser has written a now famous paper entitled Gordie Howe Would Never Make It to the NHL Today. Why? Because his parents could not afford the costs of the registration fees, the skates, the travel time, the summer skill camps, and so on. So if you compared the class background of the NHL in 1960 and today, you'd see a vast difference.
Is that what you see as well?
We see it clearly every single day, and part of that has to do with the fact that we've pseudo-commercialized youth sports throughout North America predominantly. And rather than adhere to the principles of positive youth development, where kids shouldn't really be competing before the age of 13, they shouldn't be specializing in one sport, they should be sampling as many as possible. What we have is organizations capitalizing on the interest and the demand, predominantly coming from parents, and forcing kids to specialize in very specific sports throughout 12 months of the year.
The show is called Old Enough. Shall we have a look at how he did?
Oh,
Sheldon,
absolutely.
if you would, let's roll the clip.
Let's have a look. Are you so tired?
Only the blood I have to run in back to the store. I got the fish, I got the cheese.
Okay.
And I got the grapes. Both colors.
Okay, so you're gonna go back in?
Yeah, they get the.
What kind of bread? What kind of bread?
The long bread.
Yeah, how many?
3?
We only need 2, but 3 is good.
No, Lucas.
Come on, buddy.
You are so scared. It's so funny.
No,
Okay.
it isn't legit.
Alex,
Paranoia.
what can kids learn from this kind of experience?
You know, what kids learn from this is that they can do it. And so when parents believe that their child can do it, the child learns that he can do it. But conversely, when you don't give him this opportunity, your expectation is that he can't do it. And that's what he internalizes. The way you see your child is how he sees himself. And so you don't want him to see him as being capable of something he can't do. To go down to do this all by himself without all that support wouldn't be good for a 4-year-old. But to know that he can and to believe that he can changes his sense of himself. He sees himself as competent.
Nikki, there are several episodes obviously in this series, and in some of the other episodes there are 3-year-olds being sent by themselves to go run errands, go to the dry cleaner, get the hem of Dad's pants fixed. I mean, some of the details, and a 1-inch hem, and the kid got it all right. The kid nailed it. But what do you think about the idea of a 3-year-old being sent out on errands to begin with?
I think that those 3-year-olds, I think you have to know who your child is. And I think that's a really important part. Not all 3-year-olds or even 5-year-olds will be able to do that. And I think that it's about giving challenges inside. So what I thought was really great about the show is in those 3-year-old episodes, they actually showed the children organizing the house, doing little chores. So the parents knew that the child was capable of taking on a little bit of risk or responsibility. So they weren't out in the wild on their own. And I think it's important to think about adversity, how your child manages with stress, and how, because we don't want to develop resilience, we don't want to give so much that they crumble. We want to give enough that they know that they can be successful. And I think the important part that we saw in all of the episodes is love. And I mean love as the science of love, as what it truly is, of having the child feel seen and heard and valued, know that they have a safe space to land, and know that they are trusted. When you know that you're trusted and you can come back and you can make mistakes and you can fail and take risks, you can do amazing things. And I think that's what we were able to see in the show that I was really impressed with, regardless of age. 3, I would be uncomfortable with.
Emile, how do you react to what you saw?
I think it's great. I have 3 kids, 6, 4, and 7 months. And one of the things that I'm constantly thinking about, just like you two, is how can I help them gain independence, gain confidence while living in a city where there are risks, there are real dangers. Car is my biggest fear. And give them the sense that they can accomplish things that are a little bit scary and a little bit hard. And it's so heartwarming and so wonderful and so funny. And I love that his instinct was to get 3 baguettes, because that is what a good host does. Of course. And it really makes me want to give my kids a lot more independence myself.
Alex, could a parent who watched these episodes be forgiven for thinking, this is nuts? There's no way a 3-year-old should be crossing busy lanes of traffic, even with a crossing guard, even with camera crews watching, on his own.
They'd be right to think it's nuts without all of that support, because you wouldn't want to just send your 3-year-old out to the dry cleaner without that support. That would be not wise, especially with a busy street. But actually, with all that support, I think lots of parents might look at that and say that's crazy. And that's part of our culture right now. We are too often underestimating children's emotional competencies. They're capable of a lot more than we're aware of. We've become helicopter parents, and part of that is underestimating what kids can actually take on. And as we're just saying, when we underestimate them, they come down to that level. What we need to do is work in what they call the proximal zone of development, to see that what's just becoming capable, they're just becoming capable of, and we operate in that zone. And so that sometimes they try and fail, but it won't be catastrophic. It might be a bit painful, but we believe in them. And when we believe them in that way, up they come each time. And we're a generation of parents who tend to do the opposite.
Let me go back to the parents here. What do you think your son gained from this experience?
Oh my gosh, the echoes of that day we hear every single day. He has developed a sense of self and confidence from that one experience, which is kind of shocking. But he refers to that day of shopping so many times throughout his interactions with other people at school. Something as simple as our older daughter, it took her a long time to be able to walk ahead of us to go to school. Well, Simon right now, because he had that experience, he is able to go right with her, hand in hand, and he feels that we are there for him, but he is strong enough to do it on his own.
Jennifer, I wanted to start with you. Why do we go to university in the first place?
An excellent question. I think that there's a couple different reasons for students attending university. Some professions definitely demand that university education. There's those professional schools like Teachers College, nursing, engineering, where you have to have that accredited degree. And there are many others like that in order to pursue that employment later. But other students, for those other subjects, like in the sciences, social sciences, humanities, in that case there, students are going there to achieve that higher education. Let's say they're going there to expand their thinking. They're going there because they are very interested in that subject. They want to engage in that subject, learn more about it. But in the midst of doing so, they're also learning all the important intangible skills that you're gaining in university, that critical thinking, problem solving, the ability to adapt to different changes, communicate. So that's ultimately what they're getting out of the end. They're going to learn how to think, and grow from there. And also probably because they want to be a biologist or they love history or they want to be in English. There are many reasons for students to attend, but many values in attending.
Eileen, I don't want to put you on the spot because you're representing a college, but there seems to be a little bit of a hierarchy between going to college and university. Is one better than the other?
Well, certainly they both have value, and it really is dependent upon what the individual wants to do in terms of their education and their profession. So as an example, when we think about a college education, many people think of a college education as it was in the 1960s or the 70s. The colleges in Ontario have really evolved, and we know specifically in the GTA in Toronto, the colleges refer to themselves as polytechnics, right, which provides an opportunity for an individual to start in a certificate program, move through in pathways to a diploma, to a degree, and now they have the opportunity soon to be able to do postgraduate certificates and graduate degrees in applied masters. So certainly when we think about the value of education and we think about the value of a college education, students often pursue that because they know exactly what they want to do in their profession, and they're coming to get hands-on practical skills that get them job ready, provide them with a professional network and a social network so that they're ready to practice as soon as they graduate.
Sabrina, I'm going to come to you in a minute, but Alex, university isn't for everyone, and you say that students have become more utilitarian now. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I think there's been a broad turn maybe in the last 15, 16 years or so, where students, as Jennifer said, there's lots of reasons people go to university. I think the weighting in students' mind about short-term returns seems a little bit heavier in their decision-making than it was, say 20 years ago. You do see that in surveys of students and why they want to go, and you certainly see it, I think, because young graduates young students are making more than they used to. Actually, it's what you can earn while you're a student has actually gone up quite a bit. So their opportunity cost of going to school has been a little bit higher, and so they're a little bit more careful with how they spend their time, and they want to make sure they're doing it in a way that is remunerative.
Well, I mean, when I went to university 20 years now, I'm seeing more friends of mine who are like content creators making way more money than I am. And I think the value of a journalism degree doesn't carry the same weight as it did maybe 20 years ago. And so you say we're in a skills economy, and that doesn't mean it's an education economy. What do you mean by that?
When people say they want skills, right, when employers say they want skills, governments often react and institutions often react as if what they need are graduates. But graduates have knowledge. They've sat through some classes that they don't have as the experience. And I think that's really what people want. So when people say, you know, gosh, we have this skills problem in plumbing, or we have this skills problem in digital marketing, they don't mean let's go get more students in. What they mean is I want people who have a degree plus 5 years of experience, or a diploma plus 5 years of experience. So it's actually, they're talking about training problems that happened a long time in the past. So I think for a lot of institutions and for a lot of governments, the onus, or the priority for the last few years has been to try to get students to have more experience while they're in their studies, what they call work-integrated learning. And I think colleges have always had a step on universities in that. That's always been their stock in trade. But I think you see more and more programs in institutions right across the board that are trying to deliver those kinds of opportunities to students while they study.
And rules around internships have changed in the last few years. And you see a lot of discourse online, the frustration that young grads have. They finish school, they apply for a job, but that job insists on like 3 or 4 years of experience. Sabrina, you believe that we've lost track of what university is really meant for. Why do you say that?
Well, I graduated back in 2010, which is the period that's been referenced by a couple of the other answers. And during that era, especially if you grew up in a city or the suburbs, the answer after high school was you were expected to go to university, simply because university was what you did. And in some cases, that made sense for people's educational goals and careers, but in a lot of cases, it didn't. And so what ended up happening is you had lots of young people going to university, but leaving with a lot of debt, not being able to find jobs afterwards, or being able to find careers in their field of study. And at the same time, again, being expected to have 3 to 4 years of experience for an entry-level job. I also graduated in the era of unpaid internships, which have since become illegal. So the path back then was you would graduate, then you would work for free for a couple years, and then maybe you would get an entry-level job. But even today, we're seeing young people with the exact same struggles, graduating with huge amounts of debt, not being connected to the workforce after school. And not being equipped to contribute to the economy in the areas that there are skill gaps.
Next week on the agenda.
The biggest challenge we face is not our disabilities, it's the barriers that impede us from participating because of those disabilities.
That's next week on the agenda.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.